Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jacob Reese. I am an American Enterprise Institute Collegiate Network member here at Grove City College, as well as a research fellow for the Institute for Faith and Freedom. I have the privilege of welcoming you to our 2 o'clock lecture sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute. The American Enterprise Institute is a public policy think tank dedicated to defending human dignity, expanding human potential, and building a freer and safer world. The work of AEI scholars and staff advances ideas rooted in our belief in democracy, free enterprise, American strength, and global leadership, solidarity with those at the periphery of our society, and a pluralistic entrepreneurial culture. Speaking today on the dysfunctionality of Congress is Dr. Yuval Levin. Dr. Levin is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he also holds the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy. The founder and editor of National Affairs, he is also a senior editor at The New Atlantis, a contributing editor at National Review, and a contributing opinion writer at The New York Times. At AEI, Dr. Levin and scholars in the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies Research Division study the foundations of self-government and the future of law, regulation, and constitutionalism. They also explore the state of American social, political, and civic life, focusing on the preconditions necessary for family, community, and country to flourish. Dr. Levin served as a member of the White House domestic policy staff under President George W. Bush. He was also the executive director of the President's Council on Bioethics and a congressional staffer at the member, committee, and leadership levels. In addition to being interviewed frequently on radio and television, Dr. Levin has published essays and articles in numerous publications, including Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, The Atlantic, and Commentary. He is the author of several books on political theory and public policy, most recently, American Covenant, How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again. He holds an MA and PhD from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. Following Dr. Levin's lecture, he'll be joined on stage by Jeff Pickering for a moderated conversation and audience Q&A. Jeff Pickering is the Director of Academic Programs at AEI. Before working at AEI, Jeff worked for Russell Moore at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, where he hosted the weekly Capitol Conversations podcast. He previously worked in a local church ministry and government affairs in Texas. Jeff is a graduate of Texas A&M University. This time, please join me in welcoming Dr. Levin to the stage.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, and I appreciate all of you. It's wonderful to be here. I have known wonderful Grove City graduates for many years, and this is my first time on campus, so it's really a great opportunity to see where all those wonderful people were formed. I have been asked to talk about Congress, which I'm always happy to do. It's not the most cheerful subject imaginable these days, but it's a very important subject, and I think in a lot of ways it's even more important than it seems in the very dynamic and often confusing time that we're living in now in Washington. I think we're going to spend a lot of time over the next 4 years thinking about presidential power and thinking about judicial power, because we're going to see a lot of titanic struggles between the president and the courts. And it's important in seeing those that we recognize that a lot of the reason that those conflicts happen in the way they are has to do with an institution that isn't making as much noise as the others, that isn't making as much noise as it ought to. An institution that is underactive in a moment when everybody else in Washington is overactive. So that a lot of the imbalance that we find in the American constitutional system in this moment is a function not just of presidential hyperactivity, judicial overaction, it's a function of congressional weakness. Of a vacuum created by the first branch of government, failing in a lot of ways to play the role assigned to it. And it's important to see it because it's really, I think, the most fundamental and consequential problem in the American constitutional system now. And it's often harder to see what isn't happening in the system than what is happening. It's harder to see what we have too little of than what we have too much of. And so this is really a good time for us to be focused on Congress, thinking about its role, thinking about its purpose, thinking about the various dysfunctions that it seems to suffer from in this time. The idea that we would have a president eager to use his power, that we would have courts eager to push back, would not have surprised the framers of the Constitution. The idea that we have a Congress that seems unwilling or uninterested in claiming more power for itself and in using the power that it has, I think would have been quite surprising to the framers of the Constitution. And part of the reason why it's a problem in this moment and why it's behind some of the broader dysfunction in the American system now is that it is a kind of unexpected difficulty. The American system is premised on the notion that everybody everywhere will want power all the time. And the system is kept in balance by putting these ambitious actors in one another's way all the time and requiring them to enter into conflict in order to achieve anything. Ultimately, the system is built in a way that facilitates action through intentional, designed, organized conflict. And when Congress stays out of that conflict, when Congress sees itself as fundamentally in the business of advancing the interest of the president, as congressional majorities of both parties have now done when a president of their party has been in office in the 21st century, the system is out of balance in a way that it finds difficult to answer by itself. It's vital to see that Congress is intended to be the preeminent institution in the American system. It's the first branch, not by coincidence. It's the first branch because the framers of the Constitution really assumed that the legislative branch would always be the strongest in a republic like ours. James Madison in Federalist 51 says, in Republican government, the legislative power necessarily predominates. This wasn't necessarily always good news for James Madison. He worried about it in a lot of ways. A system dominated by Congress is a system that can be dominated by a kind of confusion and strife and lack of focus. But it's also a system that is fundamentally driven by the most representative of the institutions, and that's accountable and answerable to the public in a direct way. The way in which Madison puts that point, in a Republican government, the legislative power necessarily predominates, has to be understood not only as descriptive but as prescriptive. That is, a system of government in which Congress is not predominant is not, strictly speaking, a Republican system of government. The American system is not meant to be presidential driven. It is not meant to be fundamentally answerable to the executive. It is built first and foremost to be pushed forward by Congress. And in fact, a lot of the ways in which the president is empowered, and especially the ways in which the presidency has powers that governors don't, that the traditional Republican executive didn't have, has to do with a sense that Congress would need to be restrained by some degree of presidential power. So the president is given some power to step into Congress's domain here and there, to propose legislation, to veto legislation, to be involved in some of the decisions that were left up to the legislature in the system that our country had before the Constitution. The idea was the executive, by being firm and strong, could sometimes restrain Congress. But of course, that way of thinking about it is pretty foreign to us now. It's pretty unfamiliar to us in a system that's very, very dominated by the second branch, by the executive branch. It's vital to see a couple of reasons why the framers expected Congress to be strongest. One certainly is that our system is democratic, that it's accountable to the public, and Congress is the most representative system, the most representative branch. I would say really Congress is the only representative branch. The president is elected, but the president is elected to be accountable. The framers had no expectation that a single person could be representative of a vast, diverse society, and they never speak about the president as representative. The idea of an elected Republican executive is the idea of an accountable Republican executive, somebody who would know that an election was coming and he had to think about how he was using his power in a way that could be explained to the voting public. But it's Congress, a plural institution, that represents the diversity of American society. Congress is intended to look something like America, is intended to represent the chief factions and elements of American society, and to be a venue where they can deal with each other, where they can negotiate and bargain and compromise and address common problems together. It's possible for representatives of different parts of American society to reach agreements that the people in those different parts could not themselves reach, because Congress is structured for bargaining. It's fundamentally a venue for negotiation. This is really crucial to how the Constitution thinks about its basic purpose, which is ultimately to facilitate self-government in a diverse society. There was never an expectation in the framing of the American Constitution that our system would be the scene of calm unanimity. That was not the expectation. There was certainly a hope for unity, but unity was not understood by Madison and Hamilton and James Wilson and others who thought a lot about it. It was not understood in a way that a lot of our politicians now talk about it. Contemporary politicians, when they talk about unity, they basically mean, if everybody agreed with me, then this would be a much better country. And I think that too. If everybody agreed with me, this would be a much better country. But I don't have an expectation that that's likely. And I don't think it makes sense to complain that that's not happening. This is a free society, and ultimately, in a free society, we're going to disagree. And the framers of the Constitution begin from the understanding that that is the case. They do not expect agreement and unanimity. James Madison puts this very bluntly in Federalist 10. He says, as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he's at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed, period. A free society means disagreement. And this is obvious. Anybody who's ever been in a group of people of any size knows that what happens is disagreement. And it doesn't make much sense to expect that a society, however much we have a common vision, however much we have some common hopes, a common history by now, it doesn't make sense to imagine that we will all agree. Our system is built for disagreement. And at the core of it is an idea of unity that says that in a free society, unity doesn't mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. And acting together is not the same thing as thinking alike. In fact, it's something you can do even when you don't think alike. And the American Constitution is intended as an answer to the question, how? How can we act together when we don't think alike? Everything that is mysterious and frustrating to 21st century Americans about the Constitution is a function of its being an answer to that question. How can we act together when we don't think alike? And the answer is negotiation, competition, a kind of constructive tension that is always moving forward through conflict. The American system differs in this way from a lot of the other democracies in the world. Our system is not a parliamentary democracy, where just having a little tiny sliver of a majority means you get all the power of government until you lose your majority. That's how the Westminster systems work. That's how democracy works just about everywhere it exists in the world. It's never worked that way in the American system. What you win in our system when you win an election is a seat at the table. And what happens at the table is bargaining and negotiation. Every modern president has found himself sitting in the Oval Office, looking at people he just beat in the election, and thinking, why are these people still here? And the Constitution says they're not going away. They want a seat too. And they have a right to be here, and you're supposed to work with them somehow. The place where that most fundamentally and centrally happens is Congress. Congress is the place where we act together when we don't think alike. And we do it by bargaining and accommodating. We do it by giving and taking, by making deals. That's legislative work. And ultimately, that is the fundamental work of Congress. It's the work that's meant to sit at the absolute center of our system of government. And the institution is designed to facilitate the broadening of majority coalitions. That's why Congress is so incredibly inefficient. It's intended to work slowly. It's intended to frustrate narrow majorities. To say, that's great, you got 51 votes in the Senate. Well, you can't do a damn thing unless you persuade some of the other party to come along. We find this very frustrating when we are a narrow majority. And narrow majorities are all we've had in the 21st century. So everybody's very frustrated with the Constitution. But the system is intended to drive us to channel that frustration in the direction of coalition building. Of saying, okay, well, how many Democrats can we get to vote for a tax bill that Donald Trump might sign? It's a hard question. It's not an impossible question. And it should not be treated as an impossible question, but as the beginning of a legislative process. The tradition of American legislative work in the times when Congress is functioning, and it isn't always functioning, but when it is, that's often how it works. The majority party comes in, and the first question it asks is, who can we peel off from the minority to have vote with us? Presidents think that way. Congressional majorities think that way. When Congress is not working, when it's most dysfunctional, it tends to think of itself as a parliamentary, as the center of a parliamentary system, as a kind of European parliament. And to think, well, we're the majority, we're going to do this on our own, those people need to sit and wait until the next election, what can we do on our own? That is too often what Congress has looked like in the 21st century. And the result of that has been a very dysfunctional institution. Now, I start in this way because I think that it's important to understand the way in which Congress is dysfunctional. The idea that Congress is dysfunctional is not controversial. I think we all agree. I think if you watch C-SPAN for 5 minutes, it's pretty easy to see. If you look at public opinion polling, the view that Congress is working well is held by between 9 and 12% of the public over the last 4 or 5 years. I don't know who those people are, but they're not watching C-SPAN. Friends and family of members. Yes, Congress is dysfunctional. Just about anybody would say so. But beneath that very broad agreement, I think there actually is a very important disagreement about just what function Congress is failing to perform. Even among people who are very engaged in thinking about how to reform and repair the institution, there's a disagreement about what it isn't doing. The intuitive answer to that question is that Congress is not passing major legislation. And it's not. So whatever you think the big problems are in this moment, the country's fiscal situation or immigration or maybe it's climate change, whatever you think it is, Congress is not solving it, I can assure you. But if you think about the institution from the point of view of the Constitution and from the vantage point of the intended purpose of Congress in our larger system of government, then it seems to me that you would come to the view that what Congress isn't doing is that it's not facilitating cross-partisan bargaining and accommodation. Now, this is why it's not passing major legislation. But to see that there is this underlying problem, that the problem is not just that Congress isn't passing big bills, but that it's not working to make possible cross-partisan legislative bargaining, has very important implications for how you think about how Congress ought to be fixed. If you think the problem is just they're not passing big bills, then you want Congress to be more efficient. So you want to centralize power and leadership. You want to let things move. You want to get rid of the filibuster, have the budget process work more quickly, maybe be more accountable to the president too, so that Congress is just less slow and cumbersome and can get things done. If you think the problem is that Congress is not facilitating bargaining, is not making possible deal-making across lines of difference, then you actually want Congress to be less efficient. You want Congress to force members to deal with each other. You want to make it hard for very narrow majorities to do things on their own so that they have to grow before they can really act. And that means that you want to decentralize power so that the leaders are not running everything, but committees are more important. Different factions of members can matter more. You love the filibuster, as I love the filibuster, because it's the only reason we've had any bipartisan legislation in the last 20 years, and it's also prevented a lot of very, very bad ideas from becoming law in the last 20 years. It's forced Congress to think like a legislature, to think how can we win over people who are not already won over. You want to see the committees much more central in the work of the institution, not less. Even though they take more time, they're the place where actual bargaining can happen and where members can do their real work. And when you see it that way, you come to realize that a lot of the cultural problem in Congress is also a function of the view that the place should just be efficient. The cultural problem in Congress is essentially that members don't think like legislators. Members now think like performers in a kind of partisan circus. Their view is that their job is to mouth the frustrations of their most devoted voters, to say the thing that's being said on cable news that day, whether it's on the left or the right, to say the thing that's being said on Twitter, but just to say it at a congressional hearing so that you can make a clip that you can then put on Twitter. There's a reason why members operate this way. These are ambitious men and women. They want to be prominent and important and make a difference. They want to be successful. And the question of how is success defined is a matter of political culture. They now answer that question by saying success is defined by being prominent, by having a big social media following, by being understood to be the voice of the party, rather than thinking that success is defined by being an important part of legislative bargaining, of actually making laws. And the reason they tend not to think that that's their job is that they're not really given an opportunity to do that job. Congress is very centralized. Major legislation is essentially created by 4 people, by the 2 party leaders in the 2 houses, with the president. The biggest deals are made at midnight before a government shutdown in the Speaker's office. And a lot of members just don't feel like they have anything to do with any of that. They don't spend a lot of time thinking about their committee work because their committee work doesn't result in legislation. And so the work they would do would actually not matter. These are not stupid people. They are thinking about how to channel their ambition towards success. And the institution has to help them channel their ambition towards success in a way that points toward actual legislative work rather than political performance art. At the moment, they all just run for a camera so they can express frustration. And so rather than sit in the committee, they'll find the Fox or MSNBC camera and say, you wouldn't believe what happens in this place. And you want to say to them, well, this is your 18th term. You're the chairman of Ways and Means. You are what happens in this place. But they all want to seem like the outsider, the person who really speaks for you. I'm not a politician, they'll say, after running for that 18th term. I'm just here for the people. And in a sense, they mean that. They do want to channel that frustration. They do want to help people express what they need and want out of politics, and they're not given an opportunity to do that by being a legislator. The institution, by responding to the view that Congress needs to be more efficient, has made the work of most members of Congress irrelevant, has been focused on the leadership, has been focused on a few key members and on the president, and has left Congress in a place where it isn't really enough of a legislature anymore. Reforms of the institution have to begin from the premise that this is the problem, and that ultimately what Congress has to achieve for the country is to facilitate bargains across lines of difference, to help people act together when they don't think alike. That's the purpose of our constitutional system. And that it needs to do that by enabling the people who run for office to function as legislators, to reach those bargains, to speak on behalf of their constituents, to make laws that are not clean and neat in ideological terms, that don't simply satisfy all the most devoted and intensely engaged primary voters, but that move the ball forward in a country where not everybody agrees on what the outcome should be. Only Congress can do that. It's a plural institution. The president can't represent different factions in a bargain. He's one person. Congress can do that. And ultimately, Congress is only going to function when it's given the room to do that. So how? How can the institution change in this direction? I think in some ways the direction of policy reforms is a little easier to imagine than the will to advance those reforms. But it's worth thinking through what those would look like first. There are some reforms, I think, that would have to begin from the kinds of incentives that members face. And those, in some ways, probably have to start, actually, with electoral incentives. I think it's time for both parties to do some thinking about the ways in which they select candidates for office, and especially for Congress. The primary system is not a great fit for American political culture in the 21st century. Primaries are not new. In a lot of places, they've been used to select members of Congress for a long time. In Pennsylvania, they've been used for more than 100 years. But they're not a good fit for where our politics is now. And they're not serving the parties as well as they should. Both parties, in the last 20 years, have lost no small number of races because they've run people who are not a good fit for the electorate they confront. And the reason they do that is because ultimately it's primary voters who decide who the parties put up. And primary voters are not representative. They're a narrow sliver of both parties. About 8% of Republicans vote in primaries, something like 12% of Democrats. That's a very small portion of the country. They're the people who are most engaged in politics, who care most. And so we might say, for shorthand, they're a little crazy. I'm a primary voter. I think too much about politics. And ultimately, primary voters don't think like most other voters. They tend to want ideological purity. They don't want deal-making. They don't want to see the party give ground to achieve legislation. They want to see the party stand for principle. I get that. They have to be part of how the party thinks about itself. I think this way myself. But it's not what the institution demands of members of Congress in particular. And in a sense, the way that our system operates now is we start every election cycle by asking the people who are least interested in seeing the system work who they want to run for office. And then the system doesn't work. It's not really surprising that it wouldn't. The parties have to think about how to change this because it's not working for them. I think the thing that both parties have to grasp about 21st century American politics is that they've both been losing every election for 25 years. They don't feel this way. But in the United States, when you win 50% plus one voter and you get this little tiny majority, you haven't really won the election. And the fact is, we've had only narrow majorities now since the end of the 1990s. If you look at American politics at almost any point in our history until the 21st century, you have very complicated coalition and a minority party trying to grow its own coalition and become the majority. Every now and then you have a realigning election and they switch places. But again, you have a majority and a minority. Both those parties are engaged in coalition building. They're both thinking, how do we get people who aren't already going to vote for us, whatever happens, to choose us when they could also choose the other party? For the last 25 years, we've been stuck in a place where we have essentially two minority parties. And neither of them is able to build a durable majority. They both define themselves by the other. Each party runs by saying, what matters in this election is that they not win, because if they win, the sky will fall. And that motivates your most devoted voters. It doesn't motivate voters who could go either way. And our elections over and over have resulted for that reason in 50-50 outcomes. So much so that the parties have persuaded themselves to take a narrow win as though it were a big win. This is the basic story of 21st century elections. One of our parties barely ekes out a win, and then it says, we just won a massive mandate. This is great. We can do everything we want. They immediately get going on that. They turn off the little sliver that allowed them to win, and 2 years later they lose the House, they lose the Senate, whatever it is. They lose the next election. And the other party does the same thing and says, well, now we're in the place. What happens when this is our dynamic is that neither party is learning very much. Political parties learn lessons when they lose big, and neither of our parties feels like it has lost big in 25 years. And so this is exactly how both parties now operate in every election. You win a tiny little sliver. Look, the last presidential election, which was a relatively broad electoral win for the 21st century, the winning candidate won 49.8% of the vote. The losing candidate won 48.3% of the vote. And we're treating that as a big win because it actually is bigger than most recent elections have been. That's a 50-50 circumstance. Neither party should be happy with this. They should both be looking to win in much more decisive ways. The Republicans now in the House have a 3-seat majority. This is how they're operating. I will tell you, I worked for Newt Gingrich in the last few years of his speakership at the end of the 1990s. After the 1998 election, we had a call with Newt. He was home in Georgia. And he said, well, look, we only have a 28-seat majority now. I don't know how we're going to do anything. And he wasn't wrong. He went from something like a 39-seat majority to a 28-seat majority. The Democrats in 2021 had a 4-seat majority. Republicans now have a 3-seat majority. The fact is, you can't do anything on your own that way. Nothing. And yet, in both cases, the party that won operated as though it won a big mandate and as though it had to work by itself. Republicans are moving a tax bill now on their own with a 3-seat House majority and a 3-seat Senate majority. They might succeed, but this is a crazy thing to do. The idea that you wouldn't start by thinking, who are the 20 Democrats who might vote for a bill that Donald Trump would sign, is, I think, a failure to think legislatively. And the fact that it works this way suggests that our system is not functioning in the way that the institutions are built for. It's one set of reforms they ought to think about, is ways of selecting candidates who are more likely to be a decent fit for the place where they're running, or a decent fit for the national electorate in the case of a presidential candidate. I don't have a solution to the problem of exactly how that selection should work. We have a decentralized electoral system, and we should be experimenting with different ways of choosing candidates in different places. In some places, maybe it looks like ranked choice in the primary. The Virginia Republican Party did that in 2021, and they ended up with a candidate who could win the governorship of Virginia, which is not a simple thing for a Republican to do. That's going to be a solution in some places, not in all places. But the parties have to be experimenting. They have to see the 50-50 moment as a failure on their part. Beyond that, there are some reforms of Congress that have to be thought about to change the dynamic I described to you, in which members feel like their work doesn't matter. The legislative work they do, it doesn't go anywhere. That can look like reforms of the budget process. Members now, I will tell you, and in my day job at AI, I spend a lot of time talking to members of Congress for my sins, and it's an eye-opening thing to talk with them about reforms, because there's a lot of turnover now, especially in the House. 60% of members of the House were not there 10 years ago. And so they don't really imagine that Congress could work differently than it does now. They take the budget process as a given. The budget process was created in 1974 by Democrats in the middle of a 40-year period of Democratic dominance of Congress. 40 years of uninterrupted Democratic majorities in the House, 54 to 94. And in 74, they created the budget process to help them fight Republican presidents. Well, that's not the situation that Congress is in now. And it needs to rethink the budget process in a way that could empower the committees, that could empower members, and not just leaders. It needs to think differently about how committees work. In a lot of state legislatures, a committee that gets a bill through can get it to the floor. The chair controls some floor time. In Congress, only the speaker and only the majority leader control floor time. Giving committees some control of the floor would give members a way to have their work matter. That's the problem to be solved. So think about how members can feel like the work they're doing in their committee, which is often very mundane, very dull, very detailed work, can matter. They're not going to do it if it doesn't matter. And in this moment, they don't do it. Empowering committees, a kind of decentralization, I think, is key. I'd point also to some what I would call transparency reform. There are ways in which allowing cameras everywhere in Congress has served an important purpose. Transparency matters. These people work for us. We should know what they're doing. But ultimately, the work of Congress is bargaining and negotiating. And if you've ever been involved in any kind of negotiating process, you know that it requires some degree of privacy. It doesn't actually happen in public. Members have to be accountable for what they do. But the actual work of arriving at negotiated legislative vehicles has to happen in private. The framers of the Constitution understood that. They sealed the windows in Philadelphia in the summer in 1787, 150 years before air conditioning, because they knew that the deals they were making had to be made in private. There have to be some room for at least congressional committees to do work that is not televised and that doesn't immediately end up on YouTube, so that members can talk to each other, so they can actually negotiate, so they can think together and give and take and try things out. That's now impossible to do, except, as I say, in the Speaker's office at midnight before a government shutdown, and that's why all the work gets done there. Finally, I think there's a way for Congress to learn from the state legislatures. And from the vantage point of American history, it's a strange thing to say. Generally speaking, the state legislatures have been less functional than Congress, have been much crazier than Congress. That's absolutely not the case today. A lot of our state legislatures are much more functional than Congress. And there are ways that Congress can learn from them about how legislative work can happen. Some of that is about empowering committees. Some of it is about specific modes of allowing members to come to know one another. Members of Congress basically work Tuesday to Thursday, and then they all go home. They spend no time with each other outside of what happens on the floor and in committee. They talk about each other for a living. That's what they do. They talk to cameras about other members. the institution should be structured in a way that allows them to talk to each other more. And that's a place where Congress can learn a lot, I think, from how the state legislatures operate. But above all, this has to start from a recognition of the purpose of the institution. And I think that's really crucial because what's missing are not clever ideas for how to reform Congress. There's a lot of those. We produce them at AI. There's lots of books you can find from left and right. What's missing is the will, the desire to change the institution. Members can do it on their own. They don't need anybody else. The audience for the argument for congressional reform is those 535 people. That's what it takes. But at the moment, they don't see the ways in which it might help them be better legislators, the ways in which it might offer them better ways to channel their ambition, better ways to succeed on behalf of their constituents. Members have to see that change is possible and necessary. And ultimately, members only can be moved to see things they don't want to see by their voters. The message has to come from the public in one way or another that Congress being dysfunctional isn't just something that we can sit and take forever. There have to be ways to improve and strengthen the institution. They have to think as legislators. They have to think as the absolute primary movers and actors in the American system of government. That is not at all how Congress now operates. It takes itself to be a distant third among the branches of our government, and it has to be the first and foremost mover in our system. For members to see that, I think would help them think about how to channel the political ambition that caused them to run for office. They are all ambitious. The jobs they have are hard to get and hard to keep. They're doing it for some reason. They have to ask themselves why, what they can achieve that way, and ultimately find their way towards strengthening the institution. Congress is dysfunctional, but we should all think about exactly what functions it has, what functions it's failing to perform, and what it would mean for it to be doing the job that our constitutional system requires of us. I think that now has to be at the center of civic engagement in American life and at the center of political reform in the American system. I'll end there.
I'll ask a few questions here, and then we'll turn it over to all of you. Yuval, you talked about the time that you spend for your sins with members of Congress in D.C. Who do you think is the most interesting right now?
Interesting. Interesting is an interesting word. Yeah, it's a bit of a joke to say for my sins. I actually, in talking about Congress, I should really start from an embarrassing admission, which is that I actually love Congress. If you like politics, you almost have to love Congress. And I think the institution is really full of ambitious, patriotic people, interesting people. Some in a good way, some in a bad way. I think the most interesting people are actually those who recognize what's wrong and are looking for ways to do something about it. You can find them in both parties, and they're not always. They're not the squishy centrists. They're not the people who are sort of barely identifiable in party terms. Sometimes that happens, but very often they're actually the people at the other margins of the parties who know why they're there and who understand what isn't working, find it frustrating, and looking for ways to do something about it. I think of somebody like Chip Roy from Texas. Chip Roy is nobody's idea of a moderate. He's a conservative Republican, a kind of Tea Party Republican. He is a former staffer in the House. And I should say, I'm basically going to stick to House members. I'm a former House staffer. I think the House is great. I think the Senate is less so. It has a lot going for it, but the House is where change will come from, and it's where change always comes from. All the periods of effective congressional reform have started in the House. Chip Roy is an interesting character because he knows exactly why he's there. He also knows that ultimately you do have to be a kind of team player to be part of an effective congressional coalition, but he wants to legislate. And he does want to work with Democrats where he can. he does want to decentralize power and pull it away from leaders where he can. He finds himself frustrated a lot, but he knows what he's trying to do. And I think he's really a person to watch. He's somebody who, in all these moments where you have these fights about the budget process, Chip really knows what he's trying to achieve. And I think he's one of the very few people who, if he had real leverage, could drive change in the kind of direction I'm talking about. There are some Democrats like this. I think for the most part, they actually are a little bit more of a kind of centrist Democrat. I think of somebody like Jared Golden from Maine, a very unusual member. He represents a district that went for Trump by 18 points in the last election, but in which he was reelected for a third term as a Democrat. He's from Maine, so he's an unusual Democrat anyway. But he's a former state legislator. He's somebody who thinks about Congress institutionally and thinks about it very much in the terms that I've just described to you. And he and Chip Roy actually agree a lot about what needs to change in the institution, even though they don't agree very much at all about what direction public policy should take. I think those kind of people are the most promising and interesting and impressive members. They're frustrated now, but they're trying to turn their frustration in a positive direction. There are some interesting senators too. I think they are people who try to build, in the Senate, because of the filibuster, you actually do feel pressure to build bipartisan groups around issues. The Senate committee system is very broken, and so you end up with gangs of senators. 12 senators, 6 from one party and 6 from the other, who agree about what the infrastructure bill should look like. That's actually what a committee is supposed to be. That's kind of a description of a committee. But that doesn't happen through the committee system now. It happens around it. And I think the people who are often involved in those kinds of efforts are some of the most interesting senators.
So what do they, when you're talking to them about reforms to the budget process, and particularly the elimination of the divide between the authorization and the appropriations committee, what do they tell you? Because I would think that any of them, their quality of life and fulfillment of their job would increase if the appropriations were spread out and members. So what do they? Is there any will generated there in those conversations?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the idea that change is possible is often news to members, and so when you start to talk about these kinds of concrete ideas. You're talking about changing the structure of the institution they've lived and worked in and changing the form of it that is really the only form they've known. You mentioned one of the crazier ideas that I bring to them, which is that Congress really doesn't need to have an appropriations committee. The committees that produce legislation, what they call the authorizing committees, can also spend money. They could also be the appropriators. And that would let a lot more members be involved in actually making laws that matter, in firing with real bullets in committees rather than shooting blanks. That would dramatically change how their life works. And this is really the way to talk to them, is members have a sense that their quality of life is lower than it should be. They don't love being circus performers. Some of them do, but most of them don't. And they don't love the way in which they're set against each other. They don't love the way in which they just become kind of cable news and Twitter personalities. The idea that the job could be different through changes to the structure of the institution can be attractive. It's just a set of ideas that really has to be socialized among them, because it is news to a lot of members. And so we try to talk to them about the history of Congress, about how things have been different. This is even more important with staff, because they're even newer very often and really don't know that things could be different. I had a conversation with, so I was invited to talk to the Republican staff of the House Budget Committee. This is now a little over a year ago, about some very mundane thing. But in passing, in the course of talking to them, I mentioned that I was a member of the House Republican Budget Committee staff. And back in the 90s when John Kasich was our chairman. And I mentioned in passing that the chairman and the ranking member used to meet for dinner every Wednesday during those years. to talk about committee work. And we spent the rest of the time, more or less, talking about that, because that's so different from the way in which Congress now operates. The idea that the lead Democrat and the lead Republican in one of the major House committees would actually just spend an hour together every week talking about their work was bonkers to them. And what did they talk about? Was there staff there? Who controlled the conversation? It was, part terrifying, part amazing. And I do think that there are ways in which the culture of Congress has changed in that direction. I don't think Congress would benefit too much from nostalgia for any particular moment. There was never a golden age for Congress. Those years in the 90s were not a golden age. There were a lot of problems in Congress in that time, too. But it is just worth seeing that things don't have to work the same way forever, and that there are ways to deal with the problems of today. Even if they would create some new problems that you'd have to deal with tomorrow, they would allow for more legislating to happen, and there certainly was more legislating in that period.
You wrote earlier this year, just in response to the Department of Government Efficiency and other coming clashes of executive power, that it's important to remember that the president is the head of the executive branch, but the president is not the head of our government. So how is that going to help us think clearly about some of the debates that are coming between executive power and legislative power? Again, continuing on the theme of appropriations, of impoundment, the president not spending appropriated funds. Where do you see, let's bring in the judicial branch as the interpreter here, where do you see those debates going, and how could that framework help us all?
Yeah, I think it's really worth understanding, because we're already observing a lot of conflict about executive power. We're going to see a lot more conflict about executive power over the next 4 years. And I think that distinction is crucial to understand, both because it's how our Constitution works and it's how the Supreme Court thinks about the Constitution in this moment. The first piece of it, what's come to be known as the unitary executive theory of executive power, which I think is right, that's constitutionalism, is that the president runs the executive branch. The executive branch is one person. Article 2 of the Constitution starts with a very simple sentence that says the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America, period. Everybody else who exercises executive power works for the president. And that means that if the question that we're looking at, the debate about executive power, has to do with, is the president allowed to run the executive branch, the answer is probably going to be yes. And the Supreme Court's answer is probably going to be yes. Can the president fire that person? Yes. Can the president let that 21-year-old idiot run the Treasury computer system? Yes. Maybe it's a bad idea, maybe it's not. But that's an executive decision made by essentially the CEO of the executive branch, and the president has that power. I think we're going to find also that the court thinks the president has the power to bring the so-called independent regulatory agencies under his authority. I think that's correct, too. There's no such thing as independent regulatory agencies in the American constitutional system. There are 3 branches, not 4. Everybody has to work for one of the branches, and the administrative agencies work for the president. That's not how things have worked for a while. I do think that the Trump administration, is going to try to push in that direction, and I think the courts will allow it to do that, and should. On the other hand, it's worth seeing that the president doesn't run everything. The president runs the executive branch. And if the question is, can the president ignore congressional mandates? The answer is going to be no. It's no in the Constitution, and it will be no in the eyes of this Supreme Court. This court majority is actually very insistent on the separation of powers. The usual swing votes in the court, people like the Chief Justice and Justice Kavanaugh, Justice Barrett, these are not swing votes on separation of powers. They're very committed to the separation of powers. And that means that if the question is, can the president decide that he doesn't actually want to spend money that Congress appropriated for this purpose or that purpose? The answer is going to be no, and it should be no. Congress appropriates funding. The president does not have the leeway to ignore appropriations. And so fights about that, so-called impoundment, where the president essentially says, I don't want to spend that money, I only want to spend that money, I don't think there's much of a chance that the administration can win those fights. There are ways within the law and within the Constitution for the president to propose to Congress rescissions of current year spending, saying we don't need to spend that money. Let's revise the appropriations bill and take it out of the budget so we don't have to spend it. That can happen, and the courts will certainly allow that, and Congress would love that. I don't think the administration is inclined to do that. That's the only way to do what DOGE is trying to do. To simply say, we now don't have to spend this money anymore, we're going to cut the NIH budget in half, is not going to fly. Congress can do that, the president cannot do that. And so I think it is worth drawing this distinction when we think about executive power fights. Are we saying, can the president run the executive branch, or are we saying, can the president run everything?
I'm going to come to you all for questions next, but quick follow-up to that. Where do you see the debates on tariffs going next? We're in this pause. The volatility of the stock market, to me, seems like a siren call for an Article 1 reaffirmation of.
Well, to me, everything seems like that. So
well, yeah, it's fair enough. So yeah, where do you see those debates going? And then we'll open it up.
I do think it's a siren call. You know, the tariff, the power over tariffs is a congressional power. Congress controls the taxing authority. Tariffs are taxes. I know we're not supposed to say that anymore. It's obviously true. A tariff is a tax on trade. And the Constitution specifically assigns to Congress the power to control tariffs, not just taxes. Congress has delegated that power to presidents as an element of emergency presidential power. There's a kind of emergency declaration that allows the president on national security grounds to raise and lower tariff barriers in specific instances that apply to specific national security concerns. And presidents have used that, and it's not just President Trump. Presidents have used that power very, very broadly in the last 30 years to basically act as though they control tariffs and do almost anything they want on tariff levels. Part of the reason this happens is the tariffs are not as important as they used to be as a source of revenue for the United States government. So we don't really think of them as part of the tax power. At the end of the 19th century, tariffs accounted for 85% of American federal revenue. There was no income tax. That's obviously not the way things work anymore. So when we think about taxes, we think about the income tax, and nobody would dispute that Congress controls income tax levels. But the fact that the tariff power has come to be thought of as a foreign policy power rather than a revenue power means that we think of it as a presidential power. It isn't that. But for Congress to reclaim it, they would have to pass legislation. They would have to take away the president's emergency power to control tariffs. There have been proposals to do that. A limited version of that passed the Senate, which only applied to Canada. And so it got just enough Republicans, basically border state Republicans, Alaskans and Maine, and a couple people who did it on principle. I think Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul. I don't think that bill will get a vote in the House, even though it passed the Senate. There's just not a willingness to challenge President Trump's power in the House at this point. If things get bad enough with tariff policy, maybe that changes. I think that it should change, not because things are good or bad, but because the tariff power is a congressional power.
Okay, let's open it up to questions, and we've got a microphone right up.
I'll do one over here, Yuval.
Oh, right over there.
Yeah.
Oh, of course, of course.
I'm interested in your thoughts, Yuval, on oversight power. I worked on the Judiciary Committee in the 80s and 90s, 10 years, Democrats and Republican chairman, and we legislated a lot more than we did oversight. Whenever we did oversight, it was pretty antagonistic. We didn't like doing it. We'd rather do bills. And you and I worked in the Bush administration when it flipped in 2006, and the whole story was now Congress is going to hold nothing but oversight hearings and figure out what's going on. And then it flipped for Biden, and the Republicans did the same thing. And I wonder if you have thoughts about how that impacts the way in which the legislative branch thinks about its work.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think the way you put this is right, which is that Congress emphasizes oversight when the majority is of the opposite party from the president, and tends to overlook oversight when the majority party is the president's party. Every new president since Bill Clinton has come in with his party controlling both houses. And they've all then lost at least one house. And so oversight tends to be a kind of midterm phenomenon. Obviously, that's not how it should work, and Congress should understand itself to have an oversight responsibility all the time, but it's hard to avoid that. I think in some ways, we emphasize oversight because Congress doesn't legislate as much as it ought to. Oversight is a secondary power. It's a function of legislation. What Congress does through oversight is make sure that its laws are being carried out as they're written. And when you don't write laws, you're less invested in that. I think also there's a way in which Congress uses oversight to make itself secondary to the president. If you look at the American system now, so our colleague at AI, Adam White, has put this well. I'm borrowing his description here. There's a way in which each of the three branches has moved over one seat in the 21st century. The president operates as a super legislator. We think of the president as being there to advance a legislative agenda in light of the results of the last election. That's Congress's job. That's not the president's job, but that's what we think presidents should do now. The courts play almost an executive function. We expect them to act in the present tense right now to respond to events that are happening in the world. Bring that plane back. That's not a judge's job. But judges are constantly put in that position, an essentially executive position, by the way in which the system works. Because the president is taking legislative action, judges end up responding in real time. And Congress ends up doing the work of the courts, fundamentally oversight work, past tense review of things that have already happened to see if they were the right thing to have done. That's the court's job. That's not Congress's job. And so the institutions are not built to do the work they're being asked to do now. And a lot of the dysfunction we're seeing is a kind of function of this musical chairs that's been happening. And I think the institution most at fault for that is Congress, and that ultimately the reason that all of this happens is that Congress is not doing its legislative work. It's drawing the president into that work. It's drawing Congress into a largely oversight role. It's drawing the courts into a kind of real-time executive role. So, it's all bad, but Congress is ultimately the place where it can be fixed.
Put a question up here.
Do you have the sense that most of the people in D.C. right now have the idea or the sense that, whatever they're doing at this point, if the Democrats are in power, at some point they're going to be able to do the same thing? Do you feel like there's that sense, or do you think there's just this sort of elation or this high over the fact that they're able to, move the needle at this point?
Yeah.
I'm wanting you to, I guess, talk through that.
Yeah, I think part of the kind of 50-50 dynamic that I described to you before leads people to think in short-term ways. And so to see every election as fundamentally transformative, the beginning of a new phase, and not to imagine that 4 years from now, maybe the other party will be back in power. And so they tend to do things that they wouldn't want the other party to be able to do. And they end up creating opportunities for the other party to overstep. I think a lot of what the Democrats complain about the Trump administration doing was prepared by the Biden administration. In whether that is the president acting in ways that he said himself he didn't have the power to do on student loans and other things, or in terms of thinking about the role of the courts, the extent of presidential power, the role that Congress plays. And by the way, Republicans responded to a lot of that in the ways that the Democrats are responding now, by going to a court they expect to be favorable, asking for a national injunction. They're complaining about that now, rightly, but they did it themselves just a few years ago. And so I do think that there's a failure of imagination, there's a failure to see that, the last election was really close. The next one could go the other way. And so the new powers you're establishing and creating, if you're saying that the president can tell every university in the country to do whatever he says, well, I don't know. The next Democratic president might want them to do things you really don't want them to do. And of course, that in itself is a response to what happened before. The Biden administration created conditions on federal grants that required all kind of DEI stuff. And the Trump people came in and said, well, I think we can put conditions on federal grants. That kind of one-upsmanship is the way in which the system moves further and further away from its constitutional boundaries. And so I think we always have to think, when we approach the Constitution, you have to recognize that there will be times when you're in the majority and there will be times when you're in the minority, which means you don't want to disable the majority and you don't want to crush the minority. The system works by enabling both to play essential parts. And the only way to be a real defender of the Constitution, I think, is to recognize that you're going to play both parts sooner or later.
I think we have time for one more question, and we have one right here. And before we come to it, on your point of political parties learn when they lose, not in this 50-50 just barely winning or just barely losing situation. I heard someone over here say, that sounds like the Steelers. To the last question.
Congress for the last few decades have blathered on incessantly about problems with the Supreme Court. Every time they do that, it's fraught with constitutional problems. But the district and the appeals courts are entirely creatures of Congress. Make, break, limit, improve, whatever you want to do. It seems only in the last 8 days, in the last 100 years, the Congress finally has thought about this problem. Is there any possibility they're actually going to move forward and do something that's within their power?
Yeah, I think this is one of those strange circumstances where Congress has come to think that its job is to complain along with everybody else in the country, when its job is actually to legislate and to address those complaints. I do think there are ways now in which the structure of the judiciary is out of balance, and where the lowest rung of the federal judiciary, the district courts, have taken upon themselves the power to make national policy, which is not the intent of the structure of the American judicial system. This has created problems for both Republicans and Democrats when they've been in power, and they've mostly just talked about how bad it is, when Congress could do essentially anything it wanted about this, right? The Constitution creates one court, the Supreme Court, and such lower courts as Congress may from time to time determine. That means everything else is actually up to Congress. And they do have the power, if they so choose, to think about how nationwide injunctions work, to think about how cases move through the federal courts. Now, you have to do it carefully because, again, you're going to be both in the minority and the majority one time or another. But I think, for example, that an idea that's been out there for a long time is to prevent or prohibit forum shopping, right? When Republicans want to win a case, they go to Texas, to a district court. They start it there and they win. Democrats go to California and they start a case there and they win. That kind of forum shopping is a way to achieve nationwide injunctions when you can't win any other way. By simply requiring that any case that is asking for a nationwide injunction would have to go through a lottery for where it's going to be decided. Where in the country is this case going to be considered? Should be decided at random. The courts use lotteries all the time. They assign judges by lottery in all the appeals courts. It's a simple idea. And I think just simply not knowing, am I going to end up in the Fifth Circuit or the Ninth Circuit, would prevent a lot of these cases from even happening to begin with. A very simple idea like that. And this is not my idea. It's been around. There are members of Congress who are aware of it. I think it would be relatively straightforward to legislate. Nothing's easy to pass now, but I think you could persuade a few Democrats in the Senate that this is a good idea. And yeah, Congress has to think about this as a problem that it is in charge of, like most other public policy issues at the national level.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Levin and Jeff for an excellent presentation. Thank you. If you're curious to follow Dr. Levin's work, check out aei.org. That's aei.org. Our next session begins promptly at 3.